wonderful to be here, and we have an amazing panel tonight. I'm really honored to be speaking on this, sharing this platform with activists who are in the thick of the battle for justice in Palestine and the battle for justice in the United States, which is integral to it. And this weekend I was in San Diego for the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation organizers conference, and it was the first meeting that I attended since the attack on Gaza, and it was so important psychologically and spiritually to be with people who are engaging in the fight for justice here, and I feel very much the same being with you tonight. We need to be together, we need to gather together regularly in order to sustain our strength for this battle ahead. The situation in Gaza remains catastrophic, and that makes me hesitate to use the word victory, not because I don't see that there was a victory in Gaza. There was a victory in that the Palestinian resistance withstood the Israeli assault heroically for 51 days, and those 51 days came after years of standing up to Israeli resistance, withstanding the siege. And the fight that Palestinians fought against the Israeli army was a legitimate fight. Palestinians are entitled to defend themselves. They're entitled to fight back. They're entitled to resist, as any other people in the world is entitled to resist. But we have come to a situation where we are, it's drummed into us that we should be afraid to say that, because the Palestinians are the only people denied this right. We live in a world where the US, the CIA, all the intelligence services are saying, let's arm this group, let's arm that group. Today we're fighting, last September we were about to bomb the regime of Bashar al-Assad. This year we're going to bomb its enemies. Next year, who knows who will be bombing. Maybe we'll be bombing the people we're arming now. We don't know. The Palestinians are the only people, though, who are exempt from the notion that they have the right to defend themselves, the right to seek and accept assistance in their self-defense and resistance. In fact, assisting Palestinian resistance is criminalized in this country and other countries around the world. So I want to start by saying that. Yet the cost of Palestinian resistance, like the cost of non-resistance, is high when you have an enemy like Israel. 2,100 people, more than 2,100 people were massacred, including at least 521 children. More than 11,000 people were injured, physically injured. And these are people who will have, many of whom, thousands of whom, will need years of rehabilitation or will live with lifelong disabilities in a context where there is very little infrastructure and services for people with disabilities in Gaza. In fact, the only rehabilitation hospital in Gaza, the only fully equipped rehabilitation hospital, was deliberately targeted and bombed by Israel during this massacre. So, as a way to compound the injury and the suffering over many years. By my calculations, Israel dropped the equivalent of an atomic bomb on Gaza in the space of 51 days. Thousands and thousands of kilotons, thousands and thousands of tons of high explosives. The vast majority of them, it must be said, contrary to the propaganda, Israel doesn't use, they use some of these pinpoint laser-guided bombs, but the vast majority of what Israel uses are inaccurate artillery shells, heavy artillery shells. They're devastating. They spray, one shell can spray thousands of pieces of shrapnel. That's why the injuries are so horrific. But they're very inaccurate, and entire neighborhoods were deliberately pounded with huge amounts of artillery. It's important to note that this massacre, while of course the Israelis were the ones firing the missiles and the artillery and the bombs and so on, they had many accomplices. Those accomplices include, of course, the United States first and foremost, and Barack Obama personally, who had, and I say personally because he is perhaps one of the only people on this planet who could have pulled the plug on this Israeli attack, who could have said, no, we're not going to resupply them, we're going to send a strong message this would stop. But instead, the Obama administration made sure to resupply Israel while it was massacring whole families in Gaza, while it was bombing apartment buildings, bombing schools and bombing clinics. Barack Obama, with his word, could have stopped those missiles and bombs from going out of the US weapons stores that are pre-positioned in Israel to the Israeli army. But he made an affirmative choice to continue to assist Israel to kill those children. So I think personal accountability, which is something the president preaches, is something that we should attribute and demand to him. But of course, he is part of a system and a government that is dedicated to assisting Israel's slaughter of Palestinians and assisting Israel's robbery of Palestinian land. The suffering is far from over. In recent days and weeks, horrifying mass murders have been committed at sea. There was the case of the boat of 500 people, of which it's estimated that the majority were Palestinians who fled from the devastation in Gaza, was deliberately sunk in the Mediterranean. This wasn't a tragedy at sea, it wasn't a shipwreck, it wasn't a storm. The accounts from the very few survivors that have been collected by the International Organization for Migration show that this boat was deliberately sunk by the smugglers. So it was a mass murder that is second only to 9/11 in terms of the scale of a mass murder using mass transportation. But we're not even talking about it. It's barely registered in the conscience of the world. And of course, more and more people are being driven to sea, thrown into the sea by Israel, because the situation in Gaza remains so desperate. Now, the news today, for those who have been following it, is that Hamas and Fatah have come up with yet another agreement, and yet another unity agreement, to reactivate their unity government in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. And I was asked about this earlier today on Al Jazeera. Will this succeed? Will it work? Why is it happening? And so I just want to say something about that. Of course, all Palestinians want unity. Nobody prefers to be divided. But this unity agreement, just like all the dozens of previous ones signed, will sadly not go very far, because the basic contradiction remains in place, a contradiction that was only underscored in the recent Israeli massacre on Gaza and the events leading up to it, which I'll say something about in a few minutes. But let's remember that on one side of this deal, you have Hamas, which is the largest among a number of Palestinian resistance factions that were engaged in a battle, a military battle with Gaza, that engaged the Israeli army using sophisticated guerrilla tactics and inflicted heavy losses on Israel comparatively. I mean, we saw the Israeli losses in Gaza, thank you, reaching the kinds of levels that Israel faced when it invaded Lebanon in 2006 and was stopped in its tracks by Hezbollah. And on the other side, so that's one side of the unity deal, where Hamas and the other resistance factions were engaged in war. On the other side is the Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas, which throughout this whole period continued its active collaboration with the Israeli army, the Shin Bet, and the security services to dismantle and discredit and crush Palestinian resistance. So there is no basis, and I don't believe, I've never believed in beating about the bush on these things. There is no basis for unity between a resistance movement and a proxy militia that is on the side of the occupation in practice, regardless of the highfalutin rhetoric about Palestinian rights and sovereignty and goodness knows what that you're going to hear from Mahmoud Abbas at the United Nations tomorrow. If you listen, I probably won't. But words are one thing, it's deeds that count. And the deeds are that the Palestinian Authority continues its full-throated embrace of the Israeli occupation. So there will not be a harmonious unity government. But nonetheless, what's the impetus for this? I think it's clear from the perspective of Hamas and people in Gaza that they need the siege to be lifted. And among the terms that were supposedly agreed in this movement, in this agreement today, is that the Abbas forces would be brought back to the Gaza-Egypt border to monitor the crossings. So, in a sense, you would have an Israeli proxy militia running the border crossings, which would make Egypt, of course the Egyptian military regime is allied with Israel, and so these are Israeli and Egyptian conditions that you have a proxy militia that they're comfortable with running the crossings as a condition for lifting the siege. So as far as I see, that's the only or the main reason why Hamas would agree to such a deal. I think they would have to be very careful. I mean, we saw that the guerrilla resistance in Gaza was able to surprise Israel militarily. The Israeli army were unaware of the extent of the preparations that had taken place because of the tight security that the resistance would have to operate in Gaza. And so I think they would be very unlikely to allow the Palestinian Authority, which is allied and cooperating with Israeli army intelligence, to go much beyond manning the border crossings. We'll have to see. But let's say the ingredients are not there for a harmonious unity government. And what that means for us is we have to continue to put pressure and to amplify the voices of those in Gaza who are saying, end the siege. Because what is being planned now, I mean, in the month, it will be a month tomorrow, or a month tomorrow since the ceasefire, almost nothing has changed on the crossings. Yet a few more trucks are coming in, but construction supplies are not coming in. We've heard from doctors, we've reported on the electronic intifada, that medical supplies are being held up by Egypt. And so almost nothing has changed. And so the victory in the sense of being able to withstand this assault is at risk if Abbas and Israel and the United States and the Egyptian dictatorship are allowed to reimpose the siege or to maintain the siege in a new form. So ending the siege has to remain one of our focuses.